6 in the morning, Detroit, 1948. May sunshine breaks across the Hudson Motor Car Company plant on East Jefferson Avenue. The Art Deco tower rises above the Detroit River, its geometric limestone facade catching the light like a monument to American industrial optimism. Inside, the morning shift arrives to build something revolutionary. The 1948 Hudson, the car with the step-down design that puts passengers lower and safer than any automobile ever manufactured. The workers filing through the gates believe they're building the future. The Hudson is faster than anything in its class, handles better, rides smoother. Motor Trend magazine will name it Car of the Year. Racing teams will dominate NASCAR with Hudsons, winning championships that prove Detroit engineering can beat anyone. The plant employs 22,000 workers. The complex sprawls across multiple buildings covering more than 20 acres near downtown Detroit. Joseph L. Hudson's department store, Fortune, built this factory in 1910, and for nearly 4 decades, it's produced automobiles that competed with anyone. Hudson cars aren't the cheapest. They aren't the fanciest, but they're well built, innovative, and exactly what middle-class American families want. Or so everyone believes in 1948. What nobody sees coming is that innovation won't be enough. That building the best car in its class won't matter if you can't build enough of them. That the beautiful Art Deco palace on Jefferson Avenue, with its soaring tower and limestone details, will be abandoned in less than a decade. By 1954, Hudson will merge with Nash in a desperate attempt at survival. By 1956, the Jefferson Avenue plant will close forever. By the 1980s, the magnificent buildings will be demolished, the Art Deco tower torn down, the architecture that represented Hudson's pride erased as if it never existed. The factory that built the car that won races and earned awards will become empty lots and repurposed warehouses, another forgotten monument to Detroit's lost independence. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of America's vanished automakers and the magnificent factories they abandoned, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which forgotten industrial palace I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Let's begin. Joseph Lothian. Hudson never intended to build automobiles. He was a merchant, arguably the most successful in Detroit, having founded the J.L. Price Hudson Company department store in 1881. By 1900, Hudson's store was Detroit's retail palace, 8 stories of merchandise where middle-class families bought everything from furniture to clothing. Hudson made a fortune selling goods to a growing city. But by 1909, at age 62, Joseph Hudson was looking for new opportunities. Detroit was exploding with automobile manufacturers. Dozens of companies were building cars, and most needed capital. A group of men approached Hudson with a proposition. Roy Chapin, Howard Coffin, and Roscoe Jackson had worked for Ransom Olds before leaving to design their own automobile. They had engineering expertise and manufacturing experience, but needed money. Hudson had money, but no automotive experience. The partnership made sense. Hudson provided $90,000 in capital. Chapin and his team provided the knowledge. In 1909, they founded the Hudson Motor Car Company, naming it after the department store magnate whose money made it possible. Joseph Hudson died just 3 months after the company was founded, in July 1909. He never saw a Hudson automobile, but his name would grace millions of vehicles over the next 45 years. The first Hudson, the Model 20, appeared in 1909. It was a 4-cylinder roadster priced at $900, positioned between Ford's utilitarian offerings and more expensive luxury brands. The car sold well enough that the company needed a proper factory immediately. In 1910, Hudson began construction on a massive manufacturing complex on East Jefferson Avenue near the Detroit River. The location was strategic. Rail access was excellent. The river provided water for cooling systems and potential shipping access. Downtown Detroit was close enough to attract skilled labor. The factory that rose from that site would eventually become an Art Deco masterpiece. The original Hudson plant, built in 1910, was functional but unremarkable, a multi-story brick structure typical of early automobile factories. But as Hudson grew through the 1920s, the company commissioned expansions that transformed the complex into something spectacular. The Art Deco movement was reshaping American architecture in the 1920s. Geometric forms, vertical emphasis, stylized ornamentation, and luxurious materials defined the style. Detroit's architects embraced Art Deco for civic buildings, theaters, and increasingly for industrial facilities. Hudson's expansions in the mid-1920s incorporated Art Deco elements that made the factory one of Detroit's most beautiful industrial buildings. The tower became the signature feature, rising above the main plant with geometric limestone cladding and decorative details that caught sunlight. Vertical piers emphasized height and aspiration. Stylized automotive motifs decorated the entrances and corner details. The main administrative building featured polished granite at the base, ornamental metalwork, and interior spaces with terrazzo floors and elaborate light fixtures. This wasn't just a factory. It was a statement that Hudson belonged among America's great manufacturers, that the company valued beauty as well as function, that the automobiles built here deserved a palace worthy of their quality. The contrast with other automobile plants was striking. Ford's Highland Park plant was efficient, but austere. The Packard plant was impressive for its scale, but architecturally conservative. Hudson's Jefferson Avenue complex combined industrial efficiency with architectural ambition in ways that few manufacturers attempted. Workers arriving for their shifts passed through entrances that wouldn't have looked out of place in a luxury hotel. The administrative offices could have been transplanted to a Manhattan skyscraper. The factory proclaimed that Hudson was permanent, successful, important. By 1930, the complex covered more than 20 acres with multiple interconnected buildings. The main assembly building, the body shop, the paint facilities, the power plant, all linked by rail lines and overhead conveyors. At peak capacity, the plant could produce more than 300 cars per day, more than 100,000 per year. Hudson's engineers were always innovating, searching for advantages that would differentiate the company's products from competitors. In 1948, they found it. The step-down design, officially called mono-built construction, was revolutionary. Instead of mounting the body on top of the frame, Hudson engineers dropped the passenger compartment between the frame rails. The floor sat lower than the bottom of the frame. Passengers sat in the car rather than on top of it. The result was transformative. The center of gravity dropped dramatically, improving handling and reducing body roll in corners. The lower roof height improved aerodynamics without sacrificing headroom. The structure was incredibly rigid, providing better crash protection than conventional designs. And the cars looked low and sleek in an era when low and sleek sold. The 1948 Hudson was a sensation. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year. Automotive journalists praised the handling, the ride quality, the innovative engineering. Racing teams discovered that the low center of gravity and rigid structure made Hudson's nearly unbeatable on NASCAR tracks. Between 1951 and 1954, Hudson's dominated stock car racing, winning championships and cementing the company's reputation for building fast, durable automobiles. The workers at Jefferson Avenue took pride in building these cars. They weren't assembling generic transportation. They were building the vehicles that won races, that earned awards, that proved Hudson engineering could beat anyone. The step-down design should have secured Hudson's future. It gave the company a genuine competitive advantage, something no other manufacturer offered. It attracted buyers who appreciated innovation and performance. It validated Hudson's independent status, proving that smaller companies could out-engineer the giants. But innovation wasn't enough. The problem wasn't what Hudson built. It was how many they could build and how much it cost to build them. By 1950, the American automobile industry had consolidated around the big three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. These corporations controlled roughly 85% of the market. The remaining 15% was divided among the independents: Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, Packard, Kaiser, and a handful of smaller manufacturers. The independents faced structural disadvantages that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome. Development costs had to be spread across production volumes that were a fraction of what the Big Three achieved. A new model might cost $50 million to design and tool. GM could spread that cost across 2 million vehicles. Hudson spread it across 80,000. That meant every Hudson carried hundreds of dollars more in development costs than every Chevrolet. Purchasing power was another disadvantage. GM bought steel, glass, tires, and components in quantities that allowed them to negotiate prices Hudson couldn't match. A part that cost GM $10 might cost Hudson $14 simply because of order volumes. Labor costs per vehicle were higher for Hudson because the company couldn't achieve the same production efficiencies. A GM plant might build 1,000 cars per day with 5,000 workers. Hudson built 300 per day with 2,000 workers. The per-vehicle labor cost was dramatically higher. Marketing and dealer networks amplified the disadvantage. GM could afford national advertising campaigns and maintain dealers in every market. Hudson struggled to fund advertising and watched its dealer network shrink as dealerships couldn't survive on limited inventory and low volumes. The step-down design, brilliant as it was, created additional problems. The unique construction required specialized tooling and manufacturing processes. Hudson couldn't share components with other manufacturers or spread tooling costs across multiple models. The design that made the cars exceptional also made them expensive to produce. By 1952, Hudson was losing money on every vehicle sold. The company stayed alive by consuming cash reserves accumulated during profitable years. But those reserves were finite. Without a miracle, Hudson would be bankrupt within a few years. The workers at the Jefferson Avenue plant understood what was happening before management publicly admitted it. The signs were obvious to anyone paying attention. Production volumes declined year by year. The 1948 peak of more than 140,000 vehicles fell to 93,000 in 1952, then to 66,000 in 1953. Each decline meant layoffs. The 22,000 workers of 1948 fell to 18,000, then 15,000, then 12,000. Men who'd worked at Hudson for 20 or 30 years, who'd built the step-down cars and watched them win races, were being laid off without prospect of recall. The neighborhoods around the Jefferson Avenue plant began to hollow out. The workers had been predominantly Polish, German, and African American, families that had built their lives around Hudson wages. They'd bought houses in nearby neighborhoods, sent their children to local schools, supported businesses along Jefferson Avenue and the surrounding streets. As employment declined, the economic foundation of these communities eroded. Houses went into foreclosure. Families moved away seeking work elsewhere. The businesses that had served Hudson workers lost customers and closed. The social infrastructure, the churches and schools and community organizations struggled as their membership declined. Inside the plant, morale collapsed. The workers who remained understood they were building cars for a dying company. The pride they'd felt in 1948 when Motor Trend named the Hudson Car of the Year had given way to resignation. They did their jobs because they needed the paychecks. But the belief that they were building something that would last, that their employer would honor their loyalty, that hard work ensured job security, those beliefs had died. Some workers had seen this before. The older men remembered when Detroit had dozens of automobile manufacturers. They'd watched Page, Chalmers, Saxon, and many others disappear through the 1920s and 1930s. They understood that being independent in an industry dominated by giants was increasingly impossible. The younger workers, who'd believed Hudson would employ them for their entire careers, were learning a harder lesson: that doing everything right, building excellent products, working efficiently, none of that guaranteed survival when the economics were fundamentally broken. In January 1954, Hudson Motor Car Company announced it would merge with Nash Kelvinator Corporation to form American Motors Corporation. The merger was framed as a combination of strengths, bringing together two of the largest independents to create scale that could compete with the Big Three. On paper, the logic was sound. Combined production would exceed 300,000 vehicles. The companies would share development costs, purchasing power, and dealer networks. Hudson would contribute its engineering expertise and reputation for performance. Nash would provide financial stability and management experience. In reality, the merger was a desperate attempt by two failing companies to delay the inevitable. Nash itself was struggling. The company's sales were declining, its dealer network was weak, and its product lineup was dated. Combining Hudson's problems with Nash's problems didn't solve anyone's problems. George Mason, Nash's president and the architect of the merger, understood this. His actual plan was more ambitious. Combine all four major independents, Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, and Packard, into a single corporation that might genuinely compete with the Big Three. But Mason died in October 1954, just months after the AMC merger was completed. His successor, George Romney, had different priorities. Romney focused exclusively on compact cars, believing that was AMC's path to survival. He had no interest in maintaining Hudson's presence or preserving its manufacturing facilities. The Jefferson Avenue plant was doomed from the moment Romney took control. The factory was old, inefficient, and located in a deteriorating neighborhood. Nash had newer facilities in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that could absorb Hudson's production. Romney saw no reason to maintain expensive operations in Detroit when consolidation made financial sense. In October 1954, production of Hudson automobiles at the Jefferson Avenue plant ceased. The last Detroit-built Hudson rolled off the assembly line, and then silence. The workers who'd spent their careers building Hudsons, who'd taken pride in the step-down design and the racing victories, watched their factory close. Some were offered transfers to Kenosha to work at the former Nash facilities. Most weren't. The older workers took early retirement with pensions that paid less than promised. The younger workers faced unemployment in a city where automobile industry jobs were becoming scarce. Hudson production continued for a few more years in Kenosha. But the cars built there were rebadged Nashes with Hudson trim. The step-down design was abandoned. The engineering that had made Hudson special was discarded. By 1957, AMC discontinued the Hudson name entirely. After 48 years, the brand that had competed with the biggest names in the industry was gone. The Jefferson Avenue plant stood empty. AMC had no use for it. The buildings were old and would require massive investment to modernize. The neighborhood around them was declining. The property had no obvious value. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, portions of the complex were leased to small manufacturers and warehouse operations. But maintenance was minimal. The beautiful Art Deco details deteriorated as weather and neglect took their toll. Windows broke, roofs leaked. The buildings that had represented Hudson's pride became symbols of Detroit's decline. In the 1970s and 1980s, as Detroit's fiscal crisis deepened and population collapsed, the Jefferson Avenue plant area became increasingly troubled. Crime increased. Businesses closed. The magnificent factory complex became an eyesore rather than an asset. Finally, in the 1980s, demolition began. The Art Deco tower that had been Hudson's signature, the beautiful limestone facade that had made the complex one of Detroit's architectural gems, was torn down. Building by building, the factory disappeared. Today, almost nothing survives of the original Hudson Motor Car Company complex on East Jefferson Avenue. The site has been partially redeveloped with modern industrial buildings that bear no resemblance to the Art Deco palace that once stood there. The signature tower is gone. The administrative building with its polished granite and geometric details is gone. The main assembly hall is gone. A few smaller structures on the periphery survived, converted to warehouse or light industrial use, but they're unrecognizable as parts of the original Hudson complex. Someone driving down Jefferson Avenue today would have no idea that one of America's most innovative automakers once operated there, that an architectural masterpiece once rose above the Detroit River, that 22,000 workers once built automobiles that won championships and earned awards. The neighborhood that grew up around the plant never recovered. The area remains one of Detroit's most economically challenged, with poverty rates far exceeding the city average. The houses that Hudson workers bought in the 1920s and 1930s have either been demolished or deteriorated beyond repair. The businesses that served the plant are long gone. The Hudson name survives primarily among automotive enthusiasts and collectors. Classic Hudsons, particularly the step-down models from 1948-1954, are prized by collectors who appreciate the innovative engineering and beautiful design. At car shows and auctions, pristine examples command prices that would astonish the original buyers. But this nostalgia doesn't help Detroit or the neighborhoods that depended on Hudson. The cars that remain are artifacts, disconnected from the living tradition that created them. They're beautiful machines that prove Hudson built something exceptional. But they can't restore the jobs or the community or the belief that independence and innovation mattered. Hudson's step-down design was genuinely revolutionary. The engineering was brilliant. The execution was excellent. The cars were faster, safer, and better handling than anything in their class. And none of it mattered. The design couldn't save Hudson because the company's problems weren't technical. They were structural. Hudson was too small to spread development costs, too weak to weather bad years, too independent to survive in an industry consolidating around three giants. This pattern repeated across the independent automakers. Studebaker built solid, well-designed cars. They failed. Packard built America's finest luxury automobiles. They failed. Nash introduced innovations like unit body construction and reclining seats. They survived only by absorbing Hudson and eventually became a footnote to AMC's history. The independents weren't failing because they built bad products. They were failing because the economics of automobile manufacturing in the post-war era required scale that only the big three could achieve. Innovation became irrelevant when the cost structure made survival impossible. Hudson's racing victories showcased this paradox perfectly. The company built cars that dominated NASCAR, winning championships and proving that Hudson engineering could beat anyone. Those victories generated publicity and attracted performance-minded buyers, but they didn't generate enough sales to cover the company's losses. You can't race your way to profitability when every car you sell loses money. The step-down design should have been Hudson's salvation. Instead, it became evidence of a tragic truth. Building the best car in your class means nothing if you can't build enough of them cheaply enough to survive. The Art Deco additions to the Jefferson Avenue plant in the 1920s represented more than aesthetic ambition. They represented confidence that Hudson would last forever, that the company would remain important enough to justify architectural monuments. The tower rising above the factory proclaimed permanence. The limestone facade and geometric details announced that Hudson belonged among America's great manufacturers. The beautiful administrative spaces, with their terrazzo floors and ornamental metalwork, suggested that this company was building not just for today, but for generations. All of that confidence was misplaced. The architectural investment in the 1920s came at exactly the moment when Hudson's long-term vulnerability was becoming apparent. The Big Three were emerging. The independents were beginning their slow death. Hudson was building monuments to its own importance, just as that importance was starting to erode. The irony is that the architectural beauty made the eventual demolition more tragic. If the Jefferson Avenue plant had been merely functional, its disappearance would have been unremarkable. But destroying an Art Deco masterpiece, tearing down a tower that was genuinely beautiful, demolishing architectural details that represented the peak of 1920s industrial design that felt like vandalism. Detroit lost something irreplaceable when the Hudson Tower came down. Not just a factory, but a work of art. Not just a manufacturing facility, but a monument to an era when American industry believed it was building forever. The demolition happened quietly in the 1980s, when Detroit was collapsing and nobody had energy to fight for preservation. The city was losing 10,000 residents per year. Crime was epidemic. The municipal government was nearly bankrupt. Saving a deteriorating Art Deco factory complex wasn't anyone's priority. So it came down, piece by piece, until nothing remained except photographs and memories. Could Hudson have survived? The question is complicated because survival required changes that would have destroyed what made Hudson valuable. The company could have survived by abandoning independence, accepting a buyout from one of the Big Three in the 1940s when Hudson still had value. But that would have meant losing the Hudson identity, becoming another nameplate in a larger corporation's portfolio. The company could have survived by abandoning innovation, building simpler cars that shared components with competitors to reduce costs. But that would have eliminated Hudson's competitive advantage, the engineering excellence that differentiated the brand. The company could have survived by abandoning manufacturing, becoming a design and marketing operation that contracted production to larger manufacturers. But that would have cost thousands of jobs and eliminated any meaningful independence. Every path to survival required Hudson to stop being Hudson. The merger with Nash was supposed to provide the scale necessary to compete. Instead, it accelerated both companies' demise. Nash's George Romney had no interest in maintaining Hudson's identity or facilities. The merger gave him cover to eliminate a competitor while consolidating production in his preferred locations. The broader question is whether we lost something important when the independents died. The Big Three certainly became more efficient without independent competitors. Consolidation reduced redundant development and achieved economies of scale that lowered costs. But consolidation also reduced diversity. The automobile industry became less innovative, less willing to take risks, more focused on incremental improvements to proven formulas. The independents experimented because they had to. Hudson's step-down design, Nash's unit body construction, Studebaker's distinctive styling, these innovations came from companies desperate to differentiate themselves. The Big Three could afford to be conservative, copying what worked and avoiding what didn't. When the independents died, that experimental impulse died with them. The Hudson Motor Car Company Jefferson Avenue plant operated for 44 years, from 1910 to 1954. At peak employment, 22,000 workers built automobiles that competed with the biggest names in the industry. The Art Deco Tower rose above the Detroit River as a symbol of Hudson's permanence and importance. Today, the site is mostly redeveloped with modern structures that bear no resemblance to the architectural masterpiece that once stood there. Joseph L. Hudson never saw a Hudson automobile. He died 3 months after founding the company, before the first car was built. But his department store fortune made the company possible, and his name appeared on millions of vehicles for nearly half a century. Roy Chapin and Howard Coffin, the engineers who actually designed the first Hudsons, built a company that survived the 1920s consolidation, the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war boom. They created the step-down design that revolutionized automobile construction and dominated racing. And none of it was enough. Hudson merged with Nash in 1954 and disappeared as a brand by 1957. The Jefferson Avenue plant closed in 1954 and was demolished in the 1980s. The workers scattered to other jobs or retirement. The neighborhood never recovered. The Art Deco palace that proclaimed Hudson's permanence lasted barely 30 years before the company that built it ceased to exist. The tower that symbolized Hudson's aspirations stood for another 30 years as a ruin before being torn down. The architecture outlived the company, but couldn't survive the economic forces that destroyed Detroit. What remains today are photographs of what was lost, classic Hudsons in collectors' garages, and the knowledge that building the best car in your class doesn't guarantee survival when the economics are broken. Hudson built automobiles that won races and earned awards. Hudson employed 22,000 workers at peak and built an Art Deco palace that was genuinely beautiful. Hudson innovated continuously, creating designs that competitors studied and sometimes copied. And Hudson died anyway, absorbed by a desperate merger that solved nothing, its factories closed and demolished, its architectural masterpieces destroyed, its workers forgotten. The step-down design should have saved Hudson. It was brilliant engineering that gave the company a genuine competitive advantage. But innovation can't overcome structural disadvantages. Excellence doesn't protect you when the cost of doing business exceeds what the market will pay. The Jefferson Avenue plant should have lasted centuries. Albert Kahn's reinforced concrete construction was built for permanence. The Art Deco details were crafted to endure. But buildings without purpose are just liabilities waiting for demolition. Detroit has lost dozens of architectural masterpieces because maintaining them was too expensive and repurposing them was impossible. Hudson's Tower was one more casualty of an economic collapse that valued nothing except immediate returns. The workers who built step-down Hudsons believed they were building the future. They read Motor Trend's Car of the Year award and felt pride in their work. They watched Hudsons win NASCAR championships and understood they were part of something special. And then, their factory closed, their company disappeared, and their skills became worthless in an industry that no longer valued what they knew. That's the dark story of Hudson's Art Deco Palace, a beautiful factory that built excellent cars that won races, operated by skilled workers who did everything right. All of it swept away because being the best wasn't enough when you were too small to survive. The palace fell because permanence is an illusion. The company died because independence became impossible. The workers were discarded because loyalty meant nothing to corporations facing bankruptcy. And the Art Deco tower that proclaimed Hudson's importance was demolished because nobody could afford to maintain monuments to companies that no longer existed. On Jefferson Avenue today, the site where 22,000 workers once built award-winning automobiles in an architectural masterpiece is mostly empty lots and utilitarian buildings. The tower is gone. The limestone facade is gone. The geometric details are gone. Hudson is gone. What remains is the lesson that excellence, innovation, and beauty aren't enough. That building the best product in your class doesn't guarantee survival. That architectural monuments proclaiming permanence can't make permanence real. That workers who give companies decades of service can be discarded without hesitation. That's the dark story. Not just of Hudson, but of every independent manufacturer that couldn't survive consolidation. Not just of Detroit's Art Deco Palace, but of every beautiful building demolished because maintaining it was too expensive. Not just of 22,000 jobs lost, but of an entire way of life that disappeared when American manufacturing transformed from craft to efficiency, from innovation to cost minimization, from building things that lasted to building things that sold. The Hudson Motor Car Company built automobiles for 48 years. The Art Deco Palace on Jefferson Avenue proclaimed its importance for 74 years. Both are gone now, remembered only by enthusiasts and historians who understand that what was lost can never be recovered.